Hey everybody, and welcome back to Cognitive Psychology. We're going to be diving into Chapter 5 now, which is all about attention. So, I like this textbook for a number of reasons. One of the reasons why I really like it is the way that it is structured. It flows very naturally from topic to topic, I think. So Chapter 5 is going to deal a lot with what we talked about in Chapter 4 with object recognition and with Chapter 6, which is about memory. So you can think of this chapter as kind of bridging these two fields. With that being said, as you've read this chapter, you may notice that there are a couple of items that I covered already in previous chapters. So specifically, looking at the binding problem and things like that, that is covered in this chapter, but that is actually something that we covered last chapter. All right, so just good background information to know. All right, hope you're doing well. Let's get into it. All right, so this chapter is all about attention, obviously. So we're going to be looking at a couple of big questions like what attention is, what are the specifics of visual and auditory attention, and we will be looking at different kinds of theories about how attention is filtered, what kinds of metaphors we can use to talk about attention, and then we'll also talk about things like what attention is like in the brain and whether or not we can multitask effectively. So I mention this almost always at the beginning of the chapter, but it's really important on this specific chapter. Check out these videos before you even look at the next slide. What I want you to do is if you have a minute, pause this, go over to our link right here, the first one, and you're going to find something interesting there. It is a quick awareness test. It only takes a minute, but I need you to see it. Okay, so I need you, because otherwise it's going to ruin it, and you won't get nearly as much out of what I'm about to talk about on the next slide. So I want you to go watch at least this first link. The second link is also good too, but it should be interesting. It should be surprising. You're going to be asked to detect. I'm not even going to go into it. Just check it out. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you checked it out, and if you didn't, shame on you, because you're going to spoil this for yourself, and it's really fun. But basically, if you watched this video, then you know there is something very interesting about it, and that interesting thing is that something comes across the screen and leaves, usually without us ever really realizing it the first time around. So in that example, which was based on a commercial in Britain, you have these people passing a ball, and what happens is you're so caught up looking at people with the white shirts passing the ball back and forth that you neglect to see a moonwalking bear pass through your field of vision. So that is all based on a psychological experiment, that's kind of cool, like that basically they did this commercial because this experiment from the late 90s essentially did just that. They had people come in, they had them watch a video, and in this video they had people with white shirts and people with black shirts, and the people with white shirts were passing it to one another, and they were asked how many times did the team in white pass the ball. And during this, you see this kooky looking gorilla. He's passing through, and a lot of people did not recognize that actually happened. They were surprised to hear that. And whenever I go over this in class, in a classroom setting, usually I will ask, okay, what did you notice about this video? And one or two, sometimes three, people will notice that moonwalking bear, but for the most part, people do not. So the question then is, why? Why is it that a lot of people do not pick up on this moonwalking bear? All right, or this gorilla. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about attention. So when we talk about what attention is found a lot in cognitive psych textbooks, but you're not really going to find it in a lot of learning textbooks, which is always kind of interesting to me because attention informs a lot of what we do, right? Like, it's hard to imagine going to school without attention, or watching TV without attention, or playing video games without attention, or listening to music without attention. Everything that we do that's purposeful generally has attention involved with it. And even way back in the earliest days of psychology, people were interested in attention. William James, our homeboy who wrote the very first American textbook in psychology, in that book wrote, "Everyone knows what attention is." And of course, he did go into a lot more detail than that, but whenever he was pressed to define what it was, he basically fell back on this, that everybody knows what attention is. And that's not super helpful from a scientific point of view. But it is important to think about for a moment that we do know what attention is, right? You've learned to pay attention. You've learned to focus. You've learned how to block out things that are distracting you. But what is it actually? And I think that maybe one way that we can usefully pursue this is to think about how we study attention, because the way that we study attention is going to dictate how we define attention. And that's true for all psychology, right? That every time we're talking about a specific kind of behavior, we first have to define it, and we usually define it based on how we are devising an experiment around it. Okay, so let's talk about eye tracking methods as an example, because I was talking about learning, and one of the things that sometimes people say is like, well, you can't see attention. And if that's true, let's push that idea a little bit. So eye tracking is a new technology that researchers use. I use it in my lab, where you can hopefully try to get an idea of what someone is looking at. And if you can do that, then you might be able to ascertain what they are paying attention to. That makes sense, right? That if you're looking at where someone is looking, you might be able to assume that that is where they are paying attention. Now again, that is just an inference though. I can guarantee that you've talked to someone, they've made eye contact with you, but they weren't actually listening to what you were saying, right? You've experienced that before. And so in that case, eye tracking is not always the best way of kind of measuring attention. But this is just one way. I'm going to go over it here at the very beginning of this chapter because I think it kind of shows some of the strengths and weaknesses of the abilities to measure attention. So one way is by looking at where someone is looking, with the inference being that if they are looking in a certain area, that they're paying attention to that area. You can also look at someone's pupils, and that based on their pupils, generally the more kind of complicated or difficult a task is, the wider the pupils get. The easier a task is, the smaller the pupils get. Some textbooks have a whole chapter on something called cognitive load or cognitive effort. We would go into much more detail there about that. We're not really going to go into that much this semester. So why does this happen? Why does our pupils change as a function of task difficulty? It has everything to do with basically your fight or flight response. That this is something that your sympathetic nervous system handles, that whenever you are engaged in something, your eyes are going to dilate a little bit more to let more light in, so you can kind of basically get a better survey of your surroundings. So here is a quick infographic of some of the things you can measure looking at with eye tracking technology. So one of them, it's got kind of cut off up here, is the percentage of time that someone is focusing on something. You can look at how long they fixate on something. You can look at the first thing that they fixate on. You can look at the different motions in which they look at things. For example, if you're looking at how well someone can look at look at an app, like what are they looking at whenever they look at an app, you can trace basically where their eyes are. You can look at how complex something is by whether or not they repeatedly look at something, or you can even look at, as I mentioned, pupillometry to look at how big the workload is on a specific task. So there's lots of different things associated with attention that you can look at using eye tracking. Here's a really cool example of Google does a lot of this stuff with their search page. That basically they want their search page to be as simple and as easy to navigate as possible, and the way that they do that is generally going to be through eye tracking technology. So they will bring people in and they will measure where are they actually looking at whenever they are looking at the result page. And so you can kind of see here, this is a heat map. So the longer someone looks at something, the redder it is, and you can basically see that people are starting kind of over here on the left and then scanning over right, but not even really focusing too much on that part. It's kind of like they focus right here at the beginning part of it, and then by the time they get down here, they're not even really looking at it too much at all. Another example of this would be specific websites. This was very famously, this is kind of an old example. I don't even know if y'all remember this now, but whenever the Obama administration unveiled the healthcare website that was supposed to be kind of, for the Affordable Care Act, people had huge problems with the website and found it very hard to navigate. It was crashing all the time. And so here is an example of where someone who was looking at, who just accessed healthcare.gov, trying to find a way to get healthcare, where their attention was. So basically, kind of in the middle of the screen, you can see it shoots down over here. It comes back to this point, the third point, then it shoots over to this word, rejected, and then it comes down here. Then it comes all the way up here, making sure that you're actually at healthcare.gov, and it goes down. It goes all over the place, right? This is a mess. This is not exactly what you would want. You would want something a little bit more like this, where you can very clearly see that someone is reading this like a book, right? They're moving from left to right and then moving down. So whenever we talk about attention, a lot of what we're going to be talking about this chapter is what is called selective attention. The textbook spends considerable time talking about selective attention. And what selective attention is going to be your ability to focus on one thing, but ignore things that are not relevant to your task at hand. So is basically this two-component process that you have. On one hand, the ability to focus on something, and on the other hand, the ability to block those things out. So we're going to be looking at both of these things. The ability in which you can attend to specific stimuli, and the way that you can or cannot block out irrelevant stimuli. And so you may remember when we talked about the binding problem in the previous chapter, we were talking about that as a way in which we perceive the world, and we said that basically to perceive the world accurately, you have to pay attention. That if you're not paying attention, that sometimes objects and features are not really fused together, and that becomes problematic when we're trying to perceive things accurately. So I'm going to give you a very quick example of this is a hallmark study. This is one of the classic articles in cognitive psychology, Posner's 1980 article. If you are reading along in the book, towards the end of the chapter, you'll find that they actually refer to a 1975 article that is interesting and it is good, but I feel like it's not as clear-cut as this one, so that's why I'm showing you this one instead of the other one. And this one this task is very, very influential, used in countless numbers of behavioral tasks and neuroimaging tasks. I've used this in my own research, and I've used this in collaboration with other people. It is just used all the time. So this particular task, published in the 80s, and I will point out, this Mike Posner is not the Mike Posner that creates pop music. So it is a different person. Otherwise, that would be really cool, right? But anyways, so he was interested in how we were able to detect certain signals, and so to replicate this in our kind of setup right here, what I'm going to ask for you to do is to yourself, if you want to, or you can do it out loud, I don't care, try to think left or right. I want you to look and tell me what side of the screen this specific cue right here is appearing on. Is it on the left side of the screen or the right-hand side of the screen? If you were doing this in a laboratory setting, you'd have a computer in front of you, and you would be responding with two different keys, maybe like the left or right arrows, left or right. You're just telling me, is this star on the left-hand side of the screen or the right-hand side of the screen? I know that sounds super, super easy, but there are going to be times where you're going to get a signal on one side that might distract you. So for me, as a researcher, I would be interested in your accuracy and, more importantly, your reaction time, because accuracy is almost always 100%. I'm more interested in how long does it take you to respond left or right. All right, so here we go. So we got the fixation cue. You remember the fixation cue. So now you're looking for that star, and you're going to tell me if it's left or right. Here we go. Okay, so if you were watching that, you would have replied left, right? Because you saw the star here. But this is what's called a congruent trial, sometimes called an expected trial, because we have this irrelevant cue pop up on the same side of the screen that the star shows up. So if you're doing this and you see something flash in the left-hand side of the screen, your attention is automatically going to be oriented in that direction, so that whenever you do see the star, basically you're able to pick up on it immediately because your attention is already in that part of the screen. So that's a congruent trial. Let's try another one. So again, I want you to think to yourself, left or right. In the classroom, usually I have people smack their left hand or their right hands on the desk to let me know how quickly they can do it. Because again, that's what's most important, is how fast you can do this. Here we go. Okay, so in that case, that was an incongruent or an unexpected trial. Why? Because you'll see that we had this cue pop up on the left-hand side of the screen, grabbing your attention very briefly, and then the star, the target, showing up on the right-hand side of the screen. And so that should have theoretically, as we'll see, have you respond slower than you would have in the other trial. Here's another trial. Here's another example. Okay, that, again, the correct response was on the right, but you didn't have a cue letting you know what side of the screen that was supposed to be on. So that would be a neutral trial or a no expectation trial. And then finally, so what kind of trial was that? Just to show you one more time, you got the fixation cue, you see the distractor on the left, you see the target on the right. What kind of trial is that? If you said incongruent trial, you are correct. All right, so let's look at the results here. So here are the original paper's results. And so basically what you're able to see here is essentially the congruent, the neutral, and the incongruent. And whenever that is the case, we see that people who have the incongruent trial have about a reaction time of 300 milliseconds. That's super fast. But whenever they have the congruent trial, then they actually are at about, I don't know, what is that, 230 milliseconds? So they're shaving off 70 milliseconds. That does seem like not a huge difference, and it isn't. But the fact that this is a reliable finding, that statistically we see this all the time, means that we are genuinely distracted, that there is something else going on, that it is grabbing our attention before we can shift back over, even though we know that we shouldn't be paying attention to that distractor in the first place. Even though we know that it's not helpful, we still can't help but be distracted by it. Here is I think this is the figure from the textbook. So basically, it shows exactly the same thing, except as these are reversed. So the unexpected trials have the longest reaction time. The expected trials have the shortest reaction time. All right, so that is where I'm going to end this specific video. I'm going to pick up in the next video by talking about different metaphors in which we can study these attentional mechanisms. All right, I'll see you there. Bye.